Well, let's talk a little bit about how do you do that. Okay,
Yeah.
so I think maybe we've made the case that we need more disciple making leaders, less chasing after unicorn superstars, and more building up leaders that will multiply.
Yeah.
That's how you grow the church. That's how you multiply a movement. That's what Jesus did. Then how do you actually do that?
Right.
And so we want to kind of lay out um, two pieces to this and then show kind of how they work together. So the first section is what we call a disciple making pathway. And, Jesus had a disciple making pathway. He kind of unpacks a little bit in Matthew 28 when he says the goal is the product, as Glenn just mentioned, is to make a disciple that will multiply. And the way that you do that is said, go baptize, teach them to obey, and he says, and I'll be with you as you multiply to the end of the age. And so we've kind of extracted from that these 4 steps along the disciple making pathway, and that is explore, connect, grow, multiply. Explore meaning that it really starts with somebody exploring the claims of Christ, trying to find answers to their spiritual questions. And so we want to help people in that kind of exploration stage of their journey. And then eventually they're going to come to a place where they're ready to move to the next stage, and that is to connect with Christ through salvation, to connect with the church and community, and then ultimately to connect with the cause through serving in some capacity. So that's that connect phase. And then out of those that are begin to connect, they've given their life to Christ, they're in a group, they're in community, they're beginning to serve. Then you want to invite them to the third step, and that is to grow in their faith. And really what we mean by grow here is that you're growing up. You're learning to walk and talk just like Jesus. You are, I was thinking about Luke 6:10. That was our memory verse with my guys this morning at 6:00, which I had my grow group then. And it said, and a disciple, when he's fully trained, will be like his master. And so what does it mean like for us to train men and train women to be like Jesus, to grow in their walk with God, to grow in the way they reach their world, and to grow in a way that they learn to invest in others? That's what that whole grow phase is about. And then ultimately, those that are trained then move into that multiply stage. He said, go. Jesus in the Great Commission said, baptizing them in the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to obey all I've commanded. And then he goes on, and I'll be with you to the end of the age. That command is the command to make disciples. That's what he just said in that passage, that the goal is to make disciples. So it implies multiplication. So I know I'm kind of going through that really super fast, but I just wanted to say that this movement from people pre-conversion to connecting with Christ through salvation, the church, and serving, and then moving them into small groups where they can be discipled, and then ultimately moving them to a place where they can multiply their lives and the lives of others. That is the disciple-making pathway that Jesus laid out for us. In fact, Glenn, you and I, we did about a 2-year study of the life of Christ, and we found that literally, if you laid the life and ministry of Jesus the 3.5 years across this grid, you would see how he did that in these clear stages. Yeah. So that's pretty important.
Yeah, and I think it's really important because as you look at Jesus, you see that he definitely was sequential and segmented. That meaning that there were definitely phases that he was moving people through sequentially as they were developing, becoming that end product that he really wanted to produce. But and then you think about segment that each along that phase, there were certain benchmarks that he was wanting to develop in them as they were moving through each of those pieces of the process, so that they would, turn around and do the exact same thing. So to me, it's revolutionary when you look at the fact that Jesus was so incredibly strategic. And what do good leaders do? They develop a strategy of helping people to grow and develop to get where they need to be. Yeah. Rather than being just a menu oriented and giving lots of menu and saying, hey, take a little bit of this and a little bit of that. Jesus created this map that really helped people walk through that to get to where they needed to be.
Yeah, that's so good. Glenn, I was just listening. I hadn't told you this earlier. I was listening to a podcast, and there was a guy talking about discipleship stuff, which always interests me. And he had a lot of great things to say about disciple making. But one of the things he did, he kind of went through what does it mean to be a disciple, and he kind of talked about the importance of worship and prayer and it was time in God's word. He listed off, I think 6 or 7 things. But one thing he did not mention one time throughout it was multiplication. And I thought, that was the whole purpose of Jesus's training, was to get them to the point of multiplying. Right. And yet so many times when you read discipleship type information, they're neglecting that last piece. Why do you think that is?
I think I think it's one of 2 reasons. I think maybe one reason is because it's really the messy part of disciple making, right? Hey, we just see it as, hey, I'm just going to give them a few things, and then they can just kind of go do whatever it is they need to do. But it's the neglecting of the fact that really at the end of the day, it's missing that piece of, hey, I'm called to really turn around and then to pour my life into others and help them to explore, connect, grow, and multiply. And I think the other reason is because the people that are doing it with them aren't doing it themselves.
Yes. Yeah.
And I think, and so you're not necessarily going to have, and I don't mean that to say that the gentleman that was talking about that wasn't doing it. I'm just saying, oftentimes that's what I see is we only produce what we are or what we've been or what we've seen. And so if we've not seen that, or we're going to just cut it short of that.
As we're talking about this, I think sometimes discipleship, and I'm using my little air quotes, just using that term, becomes a very kind of me-centered approach. It's how I'm growing spiritually, and we kind of forget that it's for the purpose of the mission. Right. We got to divorce it from the mission. And then multiplication is all about the mission. This pathway starts with evangelism and ends with evangelism. It starts with my own exploration of Jesus and coming to faith in him, connecting, growing in disciple making, but then ultimately multiplying my life and the lives of others. So all that to say is that this is the first, every church must have a clear disciple making pathway. And we believe these are the basic blocks that Jesus taught. And in fact, in our book, Bold Moves, we go into great detail about how this is broken down based on the life of Jesus. Yeah. So you need that. But in order to build up leaders, you also need another piece. And this is what we call the leadership pipeline. Now, leadership pipeline is been kind of a buzzword over the last, maybe 10 years. Certainly in the secular market, it's kind of now making its way into the church vernacular. But there's a lot of talk about leadership pipeline, a lot of training about leadership pipeline. Glenn, you're probably hearing a lot about that when you do consults with churches.
Yeah, and I think it's because the immediate need is this need, hey, we need more leaders. We need more leaders. And we're like, one of the things we talk a lot about is if you're making disciples, you have all the leaders you'll ever need, who make disciples who make disciples. So again, we got to start back with asking the right question. And I think what we have discovered is that the church wants to just, unfortunately just make a lot of leaders without taking the time to really make disciples, to really focus on that end product. And then as you get people through that, you'll begin to see them you'll be able to begin to observe, hey, do they have a calling? Do they have skill sets? Do they have things that are leadership oriented? And now then we take this pipeline and we begin to work them through that, but we've helped them really become a disciple. Now we're helping them become a disciple-making leader.
Yeah. Just for those that may be unfamiliar with this pipeline, this is kind of a typical leadership pipeline. We've added 4 levels of leadership. The first one is just the leader of self. That means I'm not leading anybody. I may be a volunteer, but I have to lead myself before I can ever lead anybody else. So that's where we begin. And then the next level up would be a team leader. Maybe This is a team leader that oversees maybe the coffee team or the a guest services team, or maybe a small group, or you're going to lead a small group. There are so many teams in churches, worship team, but this is a person that gives oversight to a small group of people. And then the next level up are the leaders of leaders. This would be the person that oversees the team leads. And this may be a whole section of a church that, man, you're going to oversee multiple teams. Maybe you've got a guest services leader, and they oversee all the team leaders of all the golf cart people, the coffee people, or the greeter people, or the usher people, whatever that case may be. Those leaders of leaders are very important. And then the next level up would be a leader of a department. So this might be a student department, or kids department, or worship department, or communication department. But they're going to lead a whole department of ministry. And then lastly, you have the leaders of the organization. These oversee multiple departments. And this may be an executive team. This may be an executive pastor. Certainly a senior pastor would be in the leader of the organization level of leadership. So the goal is in the pipeline is that you just want to constantly be moving people up through this pipeline, and always looking and cultivating leaders that can move up from one stage to the next, to the next, to the next. And that's how you get more leaders and grow your church ministry. Now, a lot of people have seen this as the only way to do that, but they kind of miss the synergy that you get, which, Glenn, you were kind of talking about. When you put the pipeline together with the pathway, now all of a sudden you've got something here that has synergy together where they can begin to build. By the way, just give a couple of these little bullet points. At each step of your pipeline, you've got to identify the key skills needed to be successful. And then in addition, you've got to clarify what's required at each level of leadership, and begin to help people, train people in that way.
And it's it, and just as we would do that for that leadership pipeline, that's also you'll hear us say in a lot of the coaching and the equipping we do with leaders is that pathway has to have those things. You got to define the key skills and characteristics that are needed at each phase as people are moving through the pathway, as well as to clarify the commitment, because as they move through, you're upping the commitment as they walk through that at each stage along that pathway. And then there's this great convergence of these two meeting together.
Yeah. In fact, let's put those two together and let's show them what we're talking about here. So you've got the pipeline in the vertical axis, and then you've got the pathway along the horizontal axis. And so when you put these together, you get a lot of synergy, right? Because you're seeing now, how do these things work together? And what I've drawn out here, this L1, that's leader one, our optimal leader, this is our optimal discipleship pathway, is a disciple-making leader. And that is someone who you can see as they go along the pathway, they move from explore to connect, to grow, to multiply. They are at the same time elevating up I'm pointing to it on my screen like you can see it, but I know you can't see it, but I can see it. You're elevating up the pipeline. And so the point is that, if you're a self-leader, you could be in the explore phase, and that's great. I mean, you could volunteer and not even know Jesus. In our church, man, we would love for you to volunteer and not know Jesus, because you're going to be around a lot of Jesus people, and you're going through that, come to faith in Christ. We see this happen all the time. But if you're going to move into the connect phase, where you're really coming to faith in Jesus, you're in community, starting to serve, well, then you could qualify to move up now into maybe a team lead. But then you wouldn't want to move all the way up to your leader of leaders until you're really growing in these basic competencies of your walk with God. And you know how to invest in other people because you've been trained in the growth phase of the pathway to do that. And now you can apply that as you're a leader of leaders. But then, of course, you wouldn't want to you wouldn't want to move up into a departmental leader until you're able to multiply your life into those leaders underneath you and into other people. And you certainly wouldn't want to lead the organization until you've proven yourself to be a multiplier of disciples and a multiplier of leaders. And that's what qualifies you to be called a disciple-making leader. So, Glenn, just your thoughts about that?
Yeah, no, I think that's really good. And one of the things we see a lot, Craig, as we're working with churches, and I think even as we think about it here, is it's so easy to take someone who's eager and motivated and shows some signs of leadership skills, but has not been working through that pathway, and start putting them into levels of leadership. And inadvertently, sometimes they sabotage our progress because they don't have the disciple making DNA in them that continues to perpetuate a movement of multiplication. Because I may be able to I may have all these skill sets to go up the pipeline, but it's not at all happening on the pathway at all.
In fact, why don't you show them that next graph? Because I think that graph shows that's the problem. Yeah. This guy's a leader, but he's not a disciple maker because he's not progressed down the pathway.
Yeah.
And Glenn, I would say, man, that's the majority of pastors today.
Right.
And
laymen in the church. And I hate to use that word. That's not, but just for the sake of saying this, but we see this happen, and we see this gap, so to speak, between an L2 and an L1 all the time. And as we work with churches, they're like, man, why can we not seem to make progress? And this becomes one of these identified marks. It's like the light bulb goes on, and it's, we have a leadership malfunction because we've got leaders leading who aren't leading with that DNA, that disciple making heart. They don't have the right knowledge and understanding because they've gone up this too fast with nothing of this hardly at all.
Yeah, that's the superstar leader right there. He's jetted up the pipeline out of his charisma, his ability, but he has not progressed down the pathway enough to realize that it's not about him, it's about those he raises up around him. And so let's just get really practical about this, Glenn. What are the dangers of going out to churchministry.com or whatever format you use, and Indeed or whatever, and hiring you an L2? What are the dangers of that?
Yeah, well, first, they would not share that same DNA, right? The right. DNA of being a disciple, making disciples, and that will short circuit your process, because it'll put a lid on it, because they're going to want to lead from a different model, perhaps in a different way, and that could definitely deconstruct what you're trying to build in terms of a movement. I think another danger is that if left unchecked, sometimes L2s can look really good on the outside, but on the inside they are deconstructing and end up sometimes having compromises in character, compromises in their conduct, because they shoot up so fast or shoot through so fast that they're just unable to handle that in a humble yet in a Christ-like way.
Yeah,
I think those are some of the two biggest things.
No, I think you're right on. I think just building on what you just said, many times these L2s, because they're successful and they rise up quickly, they can see their ministry as a surrogate or replacement for their intimate walk with Jesus. Mm-hmm. And so they struggle internally, spiritually, which kind of sets them up for a failure. But man, they look so great. They sing so great. They're so good with the kids. They're so creative with students, or they're a dynamic preacher, but they haven't developed enough along the pathway to really grow in these basic rhythms and competencies and skills that help them grow deeper and deeper and deeper with Jesus. And that's a really dangerous place to be. And I think maybe this is a cause of a lot of the fallout, burnout of pastors today.
One other thing, and I want to see if I can say this in a way, and you may have to clean this up a little bit for me, but I think sometimes when you go on that L2, there's a lot of aspirational in that, and nothing. I don't want to say that's wrong within a certain measure, but I want to keep pushing and pushing, and so what happens is. I go from one place to the next place to the next place to the next place when I feel like, hey, they've forced me to hit my lid because I'm not completely understanding. I'm here to help develop a movement of multiplying disciples, and that takes time and effort and energy. And it's not about me, but it's about the movement that Jesus is wanting to perpetuate. And so I want to keep skyrocketing through, kind of climbing that ladder, so to speak. And I'm going to, at all costs, I become so ambitious that I'm no good to myself or the church.
Yeah, no, you're exactly right. Well, we've seen that many, many times. Another thing is I think about the dangers of an L2 is that, they can easily, because they haven't progressed down the pathway, they can easily have a do as I say, not do as I do mentality, because they're not really living some of these spiritual disciplines out in their own personal life. And so they don't really want any examination or about their personal life, because if you crack that lid, you're not going to necessarily like what you see on the inside. Yeah. They can't say, follow me, follow my example. Paul said, follow me as I follow Christ in 1 Corinthians 11:1. And so they don't have that kind of mentality. And ultimately, they don't really build a lot of people around them. They don't raise up a lot of leaders because, as you said, they're really more focused on their career path, not on building leaders around them. And they really don't know how to build leaders around. They don't have a multiplication DNA because they're not that you get that in the grow and multiply phases of the pathway. And they just haven't got there.
Yeah, well, and I think too, they might be able to build teams too, Craig. It is interesting. We've seen this, but they build those teams for the purpose of accomplishing my vision, my goal, not the overall. Hey, we're working together to accomplish a movement, and we're. As Jesus was raising up his disciple-making team, it was with the mission in mind, not about his own success and his own well-being. It was about he was doing in order to accomplish the assignment that the Father had given him to do.
Yeah, and to empower these guys to go on and accomplish those great things, not just himself. Yeah, no, you're exactly right. So I would just say that this is the real danger. We're chasing after L2s that give us a short run benefit in ministry, but do not produce long-term results because these people have not really been down the pathway and really developed a multiplication DNA like a disciple-making leader. Now, there's another divergent path, and we call this the L3. And this is a person who's a disciple maker. They've gone down the pathway, but they have not really elevated up into leadership. Glenn, why do you think that would be?
I think some of it could be that maybe as a church, we haven't developed a really good pipeline that as we've seen, this calling and this gifting and these skill sets, we don't have an intentional process that helps to develop them into an L1 leader. I think that would be probably the one that I see most often. Yeah. Again, hey, we were there, and we were, excuse me, had to really work hard on this in every in every lane in our church. Secondly, I think another reason is because probably more than that, but more than anything too, is this idea that sometimes people get through this process and they want to continue to help others move through the pathway, and they maybe have a disinterest in wanting to lead. That can be sometimes a piece of that, but we want to help inspire them to see, hey, if God has given you a gift of leadership, we want to cast that vision really well for them to understand their efforts and energies could bring great kingdom impact by them leveraging those leadership skills to make a difference in the kingdom of God.
Yeah. I think of two guys that I knew, older men in my life. One of them really was committed to moving people down the pathway, but really had no real interest in leadership in the church. And so he really didn't have a lot of, he didn't maximize his impact that he could within the local church body. Whereas another guy, he was moving people down the pathway, but he also saw the importance of being engaged at a high level in his church and allowing the church to catch the vision of disciple making, which maximized in an exponential way the people that were moving down the pathway. And so I think if you're a disciple maker, but you're going, man, the church, I'm not so sure, the church, I'm not really into all that. You need to give that a second thought. Jesus died for the church. It's the church that multiplied and grew in the book of Acts. And who knows, maybe you will be the very one that could create a culture of disciple making within the whole body that could multiply in a really significant way. So you got this L2, L3, but L1 is the ultimate trajectory. Kind of going back to what we said earlier, Jesus was both a disciple maker and a kingdom builder. And to make disciples and build kingdoms, we need more and more disciple making leaders. And so really that's what the book is about, that we have just finished. It's in the final stages. I mean, we're maybe 30 days away, Glenn, I think, from finally getting that thing to print. And it's simply called The Disciple Making Leader. So you might give them a little idea of what they find in that.
Yeah, so I can't wait. We've been working on this project, and it really has come out of the time we've been spending with leaders across the country and listening really well and recognizing that this issue of leadership is really, really important because everything rises and falls on leadership. And in order, if you look at the life of Jesus recognized that for the movement to expand, you've got to have a growing number of leaders to help to fan that movement forward. Mm-hmm. And so the book really does a great job in kind of, talking about how we got to where we are, why is there a gap? Why is this happening in our context today? But then as you move out of that first chapter, we begin to lay out a really crystal clear strategy, real practical practices of how you can begin to move people through the pathway and the pipeline and really begin to leverage people, not use people, leverage people to be disciple makers and kingdom builders and really see a movement of multiplying disciples happen. I think it would be great for a church pastor and maybe his key leaders, if he doesn't have a staff, or he and his staff to go through and begin, and his elders to think about and to look at, and it's visionary, but it's practical, hands-on, and really is very helpful tool that I think when it comes to print, maybe late August, 1st of September, will be a wonderful resource for church leaders in this idea of making disciple-making leaders.
Yeah, we're pretty pumped about it. It's going to be rooted in the life of Christ. How did Jesus develop leaders at every level? and how did he move them down the pathway and up the pipeline at the same time. So I think you'll find this, hey, I can use these handles with every layer of leadership in our church. And so we're excited to bring it to you. We're excited to be putting it to work in our own church. This isn't just something we write in ivory tower. Man, we're banging it out. We're in the trenches too. And so we hope that it will be a great benefit to you and your ministry.
Yeah, and they can just simply go onto our website, actually for Disciple First, and learn a little bit more about that book. It's DiscipleFirst.org, DiscipleFirst.org, www.DiscipleFirst.org. There's a little deal about the book that's coming out, and then obviously the resources that we have available in the midst of all of that as well to help both Pathway and that pipeline. And so however we could come alongside you, pastors, leaders, we would love to be able to help you as you're thinking about this with wanting to get some more clarity wrapped around it.
Yeah, very good. Well, thank you guys for joining us for this webinar. We are blessed to be a part of it. We hope that this has been beneficial to you, and we look forward to helping you both make disciples and build movements where we live, learn, work, and play until Jesus comes back.